Some people from the police department like to see what a real movie's all about. This is art, all right? Do you understand where I live? I live in America, and in America, you can do what you want, and the Nazis can't come inside and fuck with your film.
This is Plausibly Live, the official podcast of the Dave Bowman Show.
Well, good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are, whatever you do. A lot of things happening in the world today, most of them far beyond our control, you might say. So perhaps it's time we took a pause and thought about the laws of humanity, politics, Congress, crimes. Don't touch that dial. Just try to hear me out for a little while. Back in 1972, and I'm old enough to remember this, and I love those years. I look back on those years with great fondness. My parents had a house in Denver, Franklin Street in Denver, near Coronado Junior High. If you want to Google it, I won't tell you exactly where it was, but you find Coronado Junior High and McElwain Elementary. We're on Franklin Street. So anyway, we had this house and it had this unfinished basement. Yeah, it was typical in that era. It really was. And I had I'm sure it was a queen-size bed. It was huge. And I lived downstairs, and all my siblings were upstairs. I lived downstairs. And I had an AM radio. I can tell you the nights that I would spend listening to the AM radio, listening to the music of that era. And I remember very well the song that came out in 1972 by Rick Nelson, Garden Party, it was called. And it was this song that he had written because Rick Nelson, who had been very popular, very, very popular in the 60s and early 70s, had done a concert at Madison Square Gardens, and he had prepared a great deal of new material. And that's not what the audience wanted to hear. They wanted to hear the old stuff, and they started booing him. They were almost, that's the famous line, it's like they didn't recognize me. It's like that, problem there. But he said in the lyrics of the song, he said, "It's all right now. I've learned my lesson well. You can't please everyone, so you've got to please yourself." As I watch what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now with this whole speaker debacle, I love that word. That's what my local news is calling it, the debacle. It was an insurrection 2 years ago. Now it's a debacle. I'm not sure it's a debacle. First off, number one, I'm not of the opinion that this is an embarrassment, nor am I of the opinion that this is a bad thing in any way, shape, or form. I've said it before. I'm a bit of a chaosian. I am a believer that when Congress is occupied with trivial stuff, they tend not to pass bills that are far more destructive to our liberty and our economy. Frankly, it's okay with me. Is it a debacle, though, or is that just a media-generated circus term that they're using? But as I'm watching this, I'm noticing now that everyone's got a solution. Everyone has a solution. Even listening to Bill Mick this morning, Bill Posey, congressman from Florida, was on Bill Mick this morning talking about potential solutions. And it comes back to that Garden Party song. You can't please everybody, so you got to please yourself. Well, in the real politic of the situation, I don't know what's going to happen. There's possible solutions here. As I said yesterday or the day before yesterday, one side or the other is going to cave, whether that's McCarthy or the conservatives. One of them is going to end up caving. And that's still, I think, the most likely possibility. That's where I look at it and go, well, at some point, we got to get moving forward and blah, blah, blah. And but then you run into the whole, do you really believe what you stood for mentality? I mean, once, okay, you made your point. 11 times, you're digging your heels in. And at that point, can you cave? Can you back off it and go, okay, we give up without getting any concessions? I don't think you can. So it's more likely that McCarthy will cave than the conservatives. But in any case, I think that's still the most likely position. Another solution potentially is that there could be a dark horse nominee. This is what happened the last time that a speaker vote went this many times or more. A dark horse candidate emerges. I guess you could call it a compromise candidate. In that particular case, it really wasn't. But in this particular case, it might be. But who out there is acceptable to both wings of the Republican Party, or all three wings of the Republican Party? The liberal wing of the Republicans, which there is one, the milquetoast wing, which is the biggest part of it, and the conservative wing, which is the smallest part of it. Who out there is acceptable to all three of those particular parties? There is another possibility, and CNN actually had an article about this this morning about the Democrats, and this was actually so I can show you the text. This is actually something that Bill Rod and I were talking about last week. Was if I were Nancy Pelosi, what would I do? Now, so far, and actually it's not Nancy Pelosi, it's Hakeem Jeffries, but it's really Nancy Pelosi. If I were them, what if they marched in tomorrow or later today, and they all voted for McCarthy in a solid block? It never happened. Okay, I grant that. But what if it did? And what if Hakeem Jeffries then goes to the microphone, with, of course, Nancy standing behind him, and makes some statement to the fact that we're here to work for the American people, and the Republicans clearly aren't, and so we're making this move forward, blah, blah, blah. Now, the truth is they don't need all 211 of them or whatever it is. They could get 44 right now, but I think once the vote started, if they saw what was happening, it might change some things. But even CNN is saying that that's, quote, the easiest solution is for the Democrats to find some folks who can join a coalition and support Kevin McCarthy. It seems like such a petty thing. It really does. But when you stop and think about it, even Congressman Posey, as I was listening to him this morning, made the comment about, well, the speaker's job is primarily administrative. More or less. The problem is that the speaker's the one who essentially writes the rules. Now, I get it. I know how these things work. They're negotiating committees and all that, but they're his rules. This is how I'm going to run the House. And he's the one that has to then enforce them. He or she has to enforce them. One of the things that has been talked about is this 72 hours, before voting thing, which, I'll be honest with you, I think it's an artificial solution to the real problem, which is that they don't care. If they actually cared, they wouldn't need a 72-hour prior circulation before a vote. But because they don't, they have to be artificially forced to have that. That 72-hour rule was in place under Nancy Pelosi's speakership, but it was never enforced. Nancy Pelosi and her wing, the Democrats, would regularly waive that rule. And so you would get bills that would be plopped on the desk and voted on. You vote on this right now. Here's the omnibus bill. Remember that? It wasn't that long ago, right? Here's the omnibus, 72 hours. We don't have time to do that. We've got to get this done. And it leaves you in a position where you wonder about things. Many people in this country are looking at this debate over the speaker and going, well, this is just demonstrating the Republicans can't govern and blah, blah, blah. While the Democrats are in lockstep for Hakeem Jeffries. Am I supposed to actually believe that all 211 Democrats, 100%, totally and completely on board with Hakeem Jeffries? That there isn't one of them somewhere that's saying, I don't like his policies. I don't like the way he does things. But they don't vote that way. While the other side is saying, well, we have a majority, but we need to talk about these things. We need to debate these things. We need to argue these things. We need to discuss these things, which is essentially what do we call that again? There's a word for it. Oh, yeah, democracy, where we debate and discuss things. All I can say about it is this, and I'm assuming that there still won't be a solution by Tuesday. I'm hoping not. I've got my fingers crossed that this will actually not be solved before Tuesday morning at 5 a.m. Pacific time. Why? because we're going to talk about it on Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live on Tuesday. But presuming that it will be or won't be is really irrelevant at this point. But I keep coming back to this very simple little idea. You ready? Imagine if the Congress of the United States had debated the omnibus bill as much as they have debated who's going to be Speaker of the House. Think there'd be any difference in the world today? As the Idaho murder suspect has been extradited back to Idaho, and the investigation of this has become more widespread news-wise, we've been told some things now. One of the weird things about this particular crime was that the police weren't talking, and they were getting a little bit snitty about some of the rumors that were happening, and that was part of the problem with the whole thing. But now, because of the unsealing of some affidavits and some things, we know some things that we did not know before, did not suspect before, or even believed the opposite of before. One of the things we know now is that one of the surviving roommates saw the man in the house. We were told originally that that didn't happen. We know now that he left the sheath. I'll get it out. Sheath. Shibboleth. He left the sheath for the knife in the house. There's a thing about criminals is there's always that one thing that they forget about. And he apparently left the sheath for the knife behind, which of course had his DNA on it, which allowed them to start tracking those kinds of things. We've learned that the suspect wanted to be a police officer. He had applied to work at the police department. There was a car that apparently was stalking the house. There was audio that did, in fact, capture a dog barking. Campus police had found his car at one point. His phone disconnected, meaning he probably turned it off. He may have gone back to the crime scene. They got their DNA sample from Pennsylvania, and so forth and so on. And these are all investigatory ideas that have led to the arrest of this young man for this heinous crime. And all that's good. I don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm okay with the fact that they've caught this guy. It seems, upon initial view, that the evidence is pretty damning. But I will tell you that over the past 15 years, as Constitution Thursday has gone on, I have become more and more cautious about things. And I'm not all that excited about a government that has a slam dunk case against an accused defendant. Those kind of things make me nervous. And as we were driving down the road yesterday, Cam and I were talking about this, and I was bringing her up to date because she'd been working and she'd missed most of the news. But I mentioned the fact that the FBI had actually called at least 2 local police departments between Moscow, Idaho, and Pennsylvania, where they arrested him, and asked them to pull him over. They knew where he was. You follow what I'm saying? They were tracking him. They asked them to pull him over on some pretext for what appears to be the sole purpose of getting body cam video of him. And as I understood it, now I may have misunderstood, but as I understood it, they were looking for body cam video, particularly of his hands. And so there were at least 2 police departments that did this, pulled him over on pretexts. And my wife reacted really oddly to that. She thought, that's really weird. Now, again, Driving is a privilege. It's not a right, but you do have a right to privacy. So it does raise some questions, I think, from a constitutional standpoint that at some point we're going to have to get into. Can the government lean on a law enforcement agency to pull someone over for the sole purpose of videotaping them? In other words, creating their own evidence. See what I'm saying? In other words, if I were just driving down the road and I had wounds on my hands, could a police officer just pull me over for the sole purpose of filming my hands to create evidence without a warrant? See what I'm saying? It does make me a little nervous. That has left me a little bit oogied out on this. I'll be honest with you. That one's kind of got me. This guy seems weird, and he seems, and this is purely a feeling, that he's probably guilty. That said, if they were so sure, why did they really need that? And that's kind of where I'm at on this. It's got me a little weirded out about the idea, especially living in an era when the government tells social media to censor people and the likes of that. It just makes me a little nervous. It makes me a little. It's got that feeling in the pit of my stomach. And it just seems like, okay, well, most of us are going to be okay with this because it's going to lead to the arrest of the criminal. But what if they're wrong? Then what is it? I don't know. And neither do they. But they apparently think that this is okay. In good news today, and there is good news today, it's a very positive thing. The Buffalo Bills safety Hamlin, who was intubated and hospitalized in critical condition, this morning they have announced that they have removed the breathing tube and that he is communicating and that he is apparently going to recover quite well, I would think. It seems to me, I'm not a doctor, but it seems like things are going very, very well for him, and that's got everybody really happy. And one of the things that started to make the circulation on social media and news last night was, I thought, even better, and that is the trainer that rushed to Damar Hamlin on the field and started the process of giving CPR. Denny Killington is his name. And even the Buffalo Bills players are tweeting his praises and thanks and all of that kind of stuff. He is a graduate of Oklahoma State University. He's from Tulsa, which is great. But he got there so fast that Cincinnati Medical Center doctors said that it was fair to say that there would have been a different outcome had it taken any longer to get CPR started and get Hamlin revived and back into the hospital. And I think that's wonderful. Trainers, first responders in that way. We've started to live in a country where I don't think it's fair to say we don't praise first responders enough. I think sometimes we overdo it. But this is a good example of an event where the first responder was able to perform the actions needed quickly, directly, and without any question, made it so that Hamlin probably survived as well as he's going to. It does raise some questions to me, though, which is, of course, he's on a football field and there's first responders less than 100 yards away. If that were to happen to you or I on the street or say at a mall or a grocery store or wherever, it wouldn't be as quick of a response. And I'm not criticizing. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's something to keep in mind, is that, it does take a little bit longer to get to places when we're not already stationed there. Clearly, this guy did a fantastic job, and I'm sure that the NFL will honor him. I'm sure that the NFL will take care of him and others that helped as well. But at the same time, it does make me think about, what if they'd have gotten to my friend Carl faster? Who knows? We'll see what happens going in the future. The NFL, by the way, has announced that the game, and that's the first thing that that Darryl Hamlin asked. He wrote, who won the game, which strikes me as bemusing, because as a former football player myself, I can see myself doing the same thing. You wake up out of a coma, and the first thing you want to know is what happened with the game. That makes perfect sense to me, and it's funny in a way. But the NFL has announced that the game will be scrubbed. It didn't happen. For all practical purposes, it didn't take place. And so those two teams will finish with 16 games instead of 17. And they'll compute the standings, because they're both in the playoffs anyway. They'll compute the standings based on the seedings, based on the standings and that sort of things. I think it's the right thing to do. There's some talk of a neutral site for the AFC Championship game if Buffalo or Cincinnati are in it, but I think that's nonsense. You play the game the way it is, and then just call it a rain out and let it go. I mean, I'm okay with it. I think Darryl Hamlin would be okay with it. I think the Buffalo Bills would be okay with it. I think the Bengals would be okay with it. I think it showed us that the NFL has its priorities mostly in the right place. I'm not going to say totally in the right place, but mostly in the right place, at least when it comes to mental health and player health, those sorts of things. So that's the good news of the day. Hamlin is recovering. He's off the intubator, and the NFL got it right. Of course, they debated it for several days. Wonder if Congress is going to keep doing that. And in the end, are we going to be singing, "You can't please everyone, so you got to please yourself"?